All right, so we're going deep into ABA today, applied behavior analysis.
Yeah.
And you've given me a bunch of stuff to look at beforehand, textbook chapters, we've got some research articles, even some online community discussions.
Right.
It seems like you're really trying to get a feel for not just the theory, but how ABA is actually used.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the most interesting part.
For sure. So today, let's break it down.
Okay.
What is ABA at its core?
Okay.
How's it being used?
Yep.
And maybe we could even take a guess at where this field is headed,
Sounds good.
where it's going in the future.
Okay.
I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this because you've obviously been digging into all this material.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about ABA is that it takes all this stuff from behavioral science, which we tend to think of as just, lab stuff.
Right.
And actually turns it into tools that we can use in our real lives, like practical applications. And I think it's also really important to remember that ABA is not about changing who someone is. It's about understanding the way their environment influences how they act. And then from there, you can kind of figure out, okay, how can we change those influences to help people do better?
To help people thrive.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. So, while I was going through this material, one of the things that really stood out to me was the idea of Skinner's Walden 2.
Oh, yeah.
Have you heard of this?
Of course.
It's like this whole concept of designing entire communities using these behavioral principles.
Yeah.
And get this. There are actual communities that exist that were inspired by that book.
Really?
20 Sloths Horcones. I mean, it really makes you think about how much potential impact this could have.
Yeah, it really highlights how these principles can be integrated into how we live.
For sure. So before we go too far into the weeds, let's zoom back in a little bit and talk about some of the key characteristics of ABA that make it so effective.
Okay.
So first of all, ABA focuses on observable behavior.
Yeah, that's a big one.
What people do, not just what they're thinking or feeling. So we're not trying to get inside people's heads.
Right.
You're looking at their actions.
Yeah, it's about focusing on what they're actually doing out in the world.
Right, so give me an example.
So let's say you have someone who is struggling with depression.
Okay.
Now, instead of focusing on how hopeless they're feeling,
Right.
an ABA approach might be to encourage them and reinforce them to have more social interactions.
Right.
Because when they have those positive interactions with other people, it can actually lead to a decrease in those feelings of depression.
So they're getting positive reinforcement from those interactions.
Exactly.
And that kind of naturally helps with the feelings of depression.
You're right. It's not about trying to change the feeling directly. It's about changing what's happening around the person.
I see. Okay, so we're focusing on the outward behavior and trying to nudge it in a positive direction.
Exactly.
But how do you actually go about changing behavior?
So that's where the idea of conditioning comes in.
Okay.
ABA recognizes that all our behaviors, the good and the bad ones, are learned through conditioning.
It's how our actions are shaped by what happens after we do them.
Yeah, the consequences.
Exactly. So a classic example is a child who's hitting their head,
Okay.
and then they get attention for it.
Gotcha.
Even if it's negative attention, it's still reinforcing that behavior.
So even if we think we're discouraging it by saying, no, don't do that,
Right.
we're actually giving them what they want,
Exactly.
which is the attention.
Yeah, and that's what ABA helps us do. It helps us see those patterns so that we can make better choices.
Right. It makes those things that we don't realize we're doing very clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So instead of accidentally reinforcing the head hitting,
Right.
you might use a technique like differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO.
Oh, yeah.
DRO. And this could be like, praising the child really excitedly every time they're playing quietly with a toy.
Okay.
So you're shifting the reinforcement to a behavior that you want to see more of.
So you're basically catching them being good.
Exactly.
I love that.
Right.
But how do you make sure these changes last?
How do they become part of the person's everyday life?
So that's where the concept of programming for generality comes in.
Okay.
ABA focuses on creating changes that are going to last and that are going to apply in all kinds of situations.
Okay.
So one way to do this is by using behavioral contracts. And this is an agreement where you lay out the behavior you want and the consequences that are going to happen,
Gotcha.
both good and bad. Do you remember the example we looked at? Connor's contract?
Connor's contract for making friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
So it said that he had to talk to another kid during recess, and then it listed all the rewards he would get for doing that.
Yeah, it was like his roadmap for success.
Right, exactly. And ideally what happens is the person starts doing the behavior, and then they start to experience those natural reinforcers in their environment. And then the behavior becomes trapped by those reinforcers. So in Connor's case, he starts talking to other kids.
Right.
He enjoys those interactions. He makes friends.
Right.
And those experiences become their own reward.
So even without the contract.
Right. He's more likely to keep doing it because it feels good.
So it becomes like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly.
Reinforces itself.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
That's brilliant. I love that.
Yeah.
But I imagine that it must be hard to study how effective these interventions are in the real world.
Yeah.
Because it's not like a lab where you can control everything.
Right.
So how do you know for sure that it was the intervention that made a difference and not just something else that was going on?
You bring up a great point because traditional research designs, like the ABCB reversal designs,
Yeah.
those can be really tricky to use in real life.
Especially ethically, too.
Exactly. Imagine if an intervention is really helping someone.
Right.
You wouldn't want to take it away just to prove a point.
Right. Of course not.
Yeah.
So how do researchers figure out what's working then?
Well, that's where multiple baseline designs come in.
Okay.
And these are really cool because they let researchers show that their intervention is working without having to take it away. And they often use these designs in situations that we can all relate to.
Give me an example.
So there was a study where they used a Patriots chart to address kids being late to class after lunch and recess.
Okay.
And they introduced this chart in different places at different times.
Okay.
So first in the classroom, then on the playground, and so on.
Gotcha.
And each time they introduced the chart, the tardiness went down.
Wow.
But only in that specific setting.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like solving a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Each piece of evidence reinforces the last one.
So you can be more confident that it was the intervention.
Right, and not just some random thing that happened.
That makes a lot of sense. That's really cool. And they've used this type of design in other ways, too.
Yeah, they've used it to improve French quiz scores by staggering when they introduce a new study technique to different students.
Okay.
And they've even used it to encourage a girl to spend more time on her after-school activities
Okay.
by introducing a reward system for each activity at a different time.
So it's a really flexible approach.
Yeah, it is.
I like that. So now that we've got a good grasp of the basics of ABA, I want to talk about how these principles are actually used to solve real-world problems.
Okay, let's do it.
One area where ABA has been really successful is in treating substance use disorders,
Yeah.
particularly with something called contingency management, or CM.
Right.
From what I understand, CM uses positive reinforcement, often in the form of vouchers that can be exchanged for goods and services, to encourage people to stay abstinent. I'm curious how well that actually works long-term.
Well, the research is pretty impressive.
Okay.
There was one study in Spain where they compared CM to the usual community reinforcement approach, which is already considered a pretty effective treatment.
Right.
And the group that got the CRA plus the vouchers, they had a 97% abstinence rate.
97%.
Compared to 80% with just the CRA alone.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, it is.
That's almost everyone in the voucher group staying abstinent.
Right.
But you mentioned earlier that maintaining those changes could be tough.
Yeah.
What happens when you take the vouchers away?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out. CM is great during treatment, but it can be really hard for people to stay abstinent after the incentives are gone.
I see.
And on top of that, there are also social and economic barriers to using CM more widely.
Right.
It makes you think, if we know something works, shouldn't we be doing everything we can to make sure everyone who needs it can access it?
That's a really good point.
Right.
It's almost like we need to have a bigger conversation about priorities and resources
Yeah,
if we're really serious about tackling this issue.
I agree.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about ABA in education.
Okay.
We've all sat through those traditional lectures.
Oh, yeah.
And let's be honest, they're not always the most exciting or the most effective way to learn.
Definitely not.
But ABA offers some pretty cool alternatives that can make learning a lot more engaging and a lot more effective.
Yeah, for sure.
Two that come to mind are personalized system of instruction, or PSI,
Yes.
and precision teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Remember reading about those?
Yeah, definitely.
So PSI is sometimes called the Keller Plan, and it basically breaks the material down into these smaller, more manageable units.
Yeah.
And then students can move through it at their own pace.
Right.
They don't move on until they've mastered the previous unit.
Exactly.
It's almost like having a built-in tutor,
Right.
making sure you really understand it
Absolutely.
before you move on.
It leads to much deeper learning, and you remember the information better, too.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then there's precision teaching, which really focuses on fluency and speed.
Right.
getting students to respond quickly and accurately.
Yeah, and they chart their progress on these special graphs called standard acceleration charts, so they can actually see how much they're improving.
So it's visual, too.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And one of the amazing things about precision teaching is that it can lead to really fast learning gains.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I read about a program in Montana where students were advancing 2 or more grade levels every year.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really makes you think how much more we could accomplish.
Yeah.
If we fully embrace these principles and really tailored education to each student's individual needs and their learning style.
Absolutely.
Imagine if we had AI and online learning platforms like Khan Academy that could actually act as personalized tutors.
Wow.
Adjusting the pace and the content based on each student's progress.
Yeah, that's the future I want to see.
That's the dream, right?
Definitely.
So speaking of really cool possibilities, let's talk about another area where ABA has had a huge impact. Autism.
Okay.
And specifically the role of early intensive behavioral intervention, or EIBI.
Yeah, EIBI.
This was one of the parts that really hit me. Because EIBI involves giving kids a lot of hours of structured behavioral intervention each week, and you start as early as possible.
Yeah, as early as you can.
And the results are incredible.
They are.
One statistic that I read that just blew my mind was that 50% of children who receive EIBI before they're 30 months old end up being indistinguishable from typically developing peers.
That's amazing.
No other treatment comes close to that.
That's incredible.
It really shows how adaptable the brain is during those early years.
Yeah.
And how powerful early intervention can be.
Absolutely.
There was also some really interesting stuff about the connection between the mirror neuron system, which is really important for social learning and imitation, and autism. And researchers are looking into how ABA interventions might be working with this system to help kids with autism learn and interact socially.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It makes you wonder if we could unlock even more potential by focusing on the mirror neuron system through EIBI.
Yeah, it's a really exciting area of research.
Yeah, for sure. But we also need to talk about the neurodiversity movement, which challenges the idea that there's only one right way to be and emphasizes accepting neurological differences.
Yeah, and some ABA practitioners are starting to incorporate this perspective into their work.
I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Because it's not always about trying to fix or eliminate certain behaviors.
Right.
It's about understanding and supporting each person's unique needs and preferences.
Exactly.
Like finding ways to help someone manage a behavior like stereotypy.
Right.
Which are those repetitive movements that are common in autism.
Right.
But in a way that supports their well-being and their self-expression.
Right. It's about finding that balance between helping people thrive in the world while also honoring who they are.
Exactly. And speaking of balancing individual needs with bigger societal challenges, we should talk about the obesity crisis.
Okay.
Because it's a complicated issue.
It is.
With a ton of contributing factors.
For sure.
But ABA offers some really promising solutions.
It does.
But before we jump into those, I think it's important to understand the biobehavioral perspective on obesity.
Okay.
Which is the idea that it's not just about willpower or personal choice.
It's more complex than that.
Yeah. Our genes and our environment work together in these really complicated ways to affect our eating habits and ultimately our weight.
Right.
That study on the obese-prone rats really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
Because those rats were genetically predisposed to be obese, but they actually survived longer during a simulated famine.
Wow.
Because of their tendency to store fat and to forage a lot.
That's so interesting.
So in an environment where food is scarce, those traits would be advantageous.
Right.
But in our world today, where we have so much food available.
Right, and it's easy to get.
And it's calorie dense.
Exactly.
Those same tendencies can be harmful.
Yeah, it really highlights how we can't just blame people for struggling with their weight.
Right. It's way more complicated than that.
It is.
So how does ABA approach this?
It takes a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
So we have to think about big policy changes.
Like what?
Like creating healthier food environments, making sure that people can get access to nutritious, affordable food.
Okay.
And then on the other side, we have to think about individual behavior modification programs.
Even when it comes to something as ingrained as our eating habits.
Right.
So there's no quick fix for the obesity crisis.
No.
But we do have tools that can help. I feel like we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, we have.
From designing communities to treating addiction to promoting healthy eating.
It's incredible.
ABA is clearly a very versatile and powerful approach.
It really is, and it's constantly evolving and expanding into new areas.
That's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah.
It's not just a set of techniques.
Right.
It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of approaching challenges with curiosity, with objectivity,
Yeah.
and always with deep respect for the individual.
I love that.
At its core, ABA is about recognizing how powerful the environment is in shaping our behavior.
Yeah.
And then using that knowledge to empower people to make the changes they want to see.
So it's like this mental toolkit
It is.
you can use in all sorts of situations.
Exactly. And once you start seeing the world through that lens, you realize how much potential there is to create positive change.
I'm excited to keep exploring.
Me too. And it's a journey, really,
Yeah.
for both the practitioner and the person they're working with.
You know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how precise ABA is. It's not just like casually watching someone.
Yeah.
It's a very systematic approach.
It-
And one thing that really struck me in the materials was all the different ways ABA practitioners measure behavior.
Right.
It's like they have this whole toolkit of techniques,
Yeah, they do.
and they choose the best one for the situation.
Absolutely. Because accurate measurement is so important in ABA.
It's like the foundation.
It's what lets us track progress, make good decisions about interventions, and really show that what we're doing is working.
So it's not just saying, oh, I think this person's doing better.
Right.
You've got the data to back it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need that concrete evidence.
Okay, so how do you get that data?
Well, the first step is defining the behavior you're interested in.
Okay.
And you have to define it in a way that's objective and measurable.
So instead of saying, like, the student is disruptive,
Right.
you'd have to be more specific.
Exactly. You need to say what disruptive actually looks like.
So give me an example.
So maybe it's talking out of turn, getting out of their seat, calling out to other students.
Yeah.
You have to break down those broad labels into actions that you can actually see and count.
That makes sense.
Good.
So once you've defined the behavior, how do you record it?
Well, that's where those different recording methods come in.
Right, the tooltip.
Exactly. Some of the most common ones are event recording, interval recording, time sampling, and duration recording.
So which one you use depends on what you're trying to measure.
Right, exactly. So let's say you're interested in a behavior that doesn't happen very often.
Like hitting.
Yeah, like hitting.
Yeah.
Event recording would be a good choice.
Okay.
You just tally up how many times the behavior happens in a certain amount of time.
So if it happens a lot, like talking out of turn.
Right. Then interval recording might be better.
Okay.
You divide the observation period into smaller chunks, like 10-second intervals, and then you mark whether the behavior happened during each interval.
So it's like taking a bunch of snapshots of the behavior.
Exactly.
Gotcha. What about behaviors that are more continuous,
Yeah.
like sitting in a chair or working on a specific task?
Then duration recording would be the most useful.
So you're tracking how long the behavior lasts.
Right. Exactly how long the student sits in their chair, how long they stay focused on their work.
I like that analogy of the camera lens.
Yeah.
Each method gives you a different perspective on the behavior.
That's a great way to think about it. And no matter which method you use, you have to make sure your observations are reliable.
So that means different people observing the same behavior should be recording it the same way.
Exactly. Consistency is key.
Which can be challenging,
It can be.
especially in real-world settings where there are distractions.
Right. There's always something going on.
How do you make sure everyone's on the same page?
It takes a lot of training. And you have to check in regularly to make sure everyone's interpreting the behavior the same way.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's all about being as objective as possible.
Okay, so this really highlights how important precision and objectivity are in ABA,
It does. It's a very data-driven approach.
which gives it a lot of credibility. Okay, before we move on, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier,
Okay.
how ABA focuses on the environment.
Right.
But what about the biological factors?
Yes, the nature versus nurture debate.
That's right.
It's been going on forever.
It has.
And it's super relevant to ABA. Because while ABA focuses on the environment, we can't forget about biology.
Right.
Our genes definitely play a role in shaping who we are and how we behave.
There was that study about the warrior gene,
Oh, yeah.
which has been linked to aggression and impulsivity.
Right.
It made me think about how we could use that kind of information to create more personalized interventions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Like if you know someone has a genetic predisposition, you could tailor the intervention to their specific needs.
It's definitely an area with a lot of potential.
But also a lot of ethical considerations.
Oh, absolutely. We have to be really careful about how we use that kind of information.
For sure. But it's exciting to think about the possibilities.
It is.
So it seems like ABA is always evolving.
Yeah, It is.
Incorporating new knowledge from genetics and neuroscience.
Right. It's a very interdisciplinary field.
Which is what makes it so dynamic.
Exactly.
And as we learn more about the brain and how genes and environment work together, we can keep refining our interventions and expanding the reach of ABA. Speaking of expanding the reach of ABA, I'm curious about how these principles are being used outside of traditional clinical settings.
Oh, yeah.
Like in organizations, even in areas like sustainability and conservation.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
The principles of ABA are really universal.
That's true.
Anytime you're trying to understand and change behavior, ABA can be helpful.
It doesn't matter if it's an individual or a whole group.
Right. It's all about behavior.
I saw some really cool examples in the materials.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
A company using ABA to reduce workplace accidents.
Okay.
And a community using it to encourage recycling.
It makes sense when you think about it. Safety protocols, recycling practices, those are all behaviors.
Right.
And they're all influenced by the environment.
So by understanding those influences and using reinforcement,
we can create systems that promote the behaviors we want to see.
So it's not just about working with people one-on-one.
Right.
It's about designing environments that support positive change.
Exactly. And as we face these big global challenges...
Climate change.
Yeah. Resource depletion, social inequity.
We need effective strategies to change behavior.
We do. And ABA has so much potential to help with that.
It's exciting to think about all the possibilities.
It is.
So I feel like we've gotten a really good understanding of what ABA is all about.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But it feels like just the beginning.
It is the tip of the iceberg.
There's so much more to explore.
There is.
But I think we've given our listener a really solid foundation.
I agree.
Wow, it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
But it's been an amazing journey.
It has.
I'm seeing the world in a whole new way.
Through that behavioral lens.
Exactly. So before we wrap up, I want to ask you this. If you could give our listener just one key takeaway, something that wasn't explicitly said in the materials, but that really came out of our conversation today, what would it be?
That's a tough one.
I know, right?
But I think what really stands out to me is that ABA is more than just a bunch of techniques or interventions. It's really a way of thinking.
A way of approaching problems?
Yeah, with curiosity, with objectivity, and always with respect for the individual.
Yeah.
At its heart, ABA is about understanding how the environment shapes our behavior.
Right.
And then using that knowledge to help people make changes in their lives.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's such a great way to put it. It's like a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
A way of seeing how our actions are connected to the world around us.
Exactly.
And like you said, we can apply that to so many different areas of life. From personal growth to relationships to even tackling those big societal problems like climate change.
It's about giving people the tools to understand what influences their behavior so they can create the lives they want.
So to our listener out there,
as
you continue your own deep dive into this field, or any field for that matter, remember to stay curious. Question your assumptions.
Always.
And keep that behavioral lens handy.
You never know what you might discover.
It's been so great exploring this world with you today.
It has. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
You're welcome.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into applied behavior analysis.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it insightful.
You did too.
And that you'll keep exploring the power of behavior.
It's fascinating stuff.
Until next time.
See you then.